We are recording the session tonight, as you just heard, and that is because we want to be able to put this on the ORC website for anybody who wasn't able to tune in tonight, so that they can watch it later on via the recording. And so, yeah, so just to make you guys aware that this is being recorded tonight. The session is for everybody is going to be, you're going to be muted for this whole session. So the way that you ask questions is via the chat function. So you should see at the bottom of your screen a little speech bubble, and that's how you go into there and you ask questions via that chat function. If you go into that chat function and you scroll to the top, you'll see there's some instructions in there tonight about how this session is going to run. The reason why we've muted everybody is because it is quite a long presentation and we've got quite a lot of information to get through. And so it's just best if we just try and get through it uninterrupted. And then at the end, Andrea will read out your questions. And then between myself and Nathan and Richard, who are from the biosecurity team, we'll answer your questions the best that we can. Some of you might have been in webinars before where you've used the raise hand function, which is the little icon that pops up. We're not going to use that tonight. So if you do have any questions or comments, please put them into the chat function. And I've already said that session is going to be recorded. So I think we will get going. So thank you to everybody who's tuned in tonight. I know that Zoom is not everybody's first option for how to do this kind of thing, but just given COVID and the uncertainty with restrictions on numbers to events, we decided to do this session as a webinar instead of a community meeting. We are going to have a in-person drop-in session later in November, and we propose to run that more as a walk-in session. So if we do have restrictions on numbers in late November, which may be a thing, we don't know yet, at least we can manage that a bit easier if it's more of a walk-in session, because we can try and stagger people coming in. Whereas tonight, it's very much about getting everybody at the same time listening to the presentation and asking questions specifically about the presentation. So thank you for being here tonight. We are going to give this presentation in 3 parts, and then the questions will be at the end. So a little bit of background. What we propose is the strategy for Gippsland, and then some examples of what landowner-led action looks like. So in terms of background, and Andrea, please tell me if I'm going too fast or if I'm talking too fast, because I do have a funny accent. So this, there's a lot on the screen just now, but there's a lot of background to where we are right now with rabbit control in Otago and in the whole country, actually. So rabbits first introduced into the 1850s. By 1867, they were already being a bit of a nuisance because the Rabbit Nuisance Act was introduced. By the 1880s onwards, lots of different control methods were starting to be used to try and control rabbits. By 1947, we obviously had rabbit boards by then and a bit of a killer policy, and funding came from rates along with a government subsidy to help to control rabbits. But in 1984, obviously a policy was adopted where the user pays and the government funding was withdrawn. So we've had no funding from central government to do rabbit control on people's property since the 80s. And by 1989, the rabbit boards were disestablished and the regional councils took over that role. And a lot of the people who used to work for the rabbit boards actually ended up going to work for the regional councils. In 1993, we had the introduction of the Biosecurity Act. But concurrently, that is when rates funding for doing rabbit control on private land was removed as well. So ORC hasn't collected rates for the purposes of doing rabbit control since 1993. In 1994, the ORC established the Regional Services Business Unit. So a lot of you might remember seeing ORC staff out and about doing rabbit control, killing rabbits. it wasn't funded by rates. It was the regional services unit, and they actually acted like a biosecurity contractor. So they would go out onto people's property and kill rabbits, but the landowner was sent a bill. So just to reiterate, there's been no rates money used for killing rabbits since 1993. In 2015, the regional services unit was actually disestablished. And so regional council staff haven't been killing rabbits since 2015, at least. And we've had the regional pest management plan has been in place. The first one was in 1996. There was revised regional pest management plan in 2019. And that is where we are now. So we're now operating under the rules of the regional pest management plan. So a bit of a bit of revision about rules, roles and responsibilities. So under the current regulatory framework, under the regional pest management plan, there is a rule that says that occupiers of land must control feral rabbits on the land that they occupy at or below level 3 on a modified McLean scale. So some of you guys would have heard of the modified McLean scale, some of you won't, but basically it is how the level of rabbit infestation is measured on any land. And what it really focuses on is rabbit droppings, rabbit poo on land, and specifically buck heaps. So male rabbits will poo in an area, and it'll create a bit of a mound, and that's a buck heap. And so that's what the modified McLean scale measures. So we don't come onto your property and count rabbits, because rabbits move around, so it's not very easy to do. It's more about measuring the buck heaps, and that's the modified McLean scale. So the responsibility for complying with that rule sits with the landowner occupier. So what's ORC doing all of this? Well, ORC's role is to require landowners to meet the rule. And ORC does this through inspections, through enforcement, through requiring compliance. But what we prefer to do is to try and do education, awareness and advocacy, and to get people, doing the right thing voluntarily. But if we can't get people to do that, then we do have the compliance function to fall back on. So what have we been doing in this space recently for Gibston? Well, we put out a survey, and we asked people to fill in a survey just to understand more about what rabbits mean to you in Gibston and what people are doing about it. We didn't get a lot of respondents to the survey, about a sixth of the landowners, but those who did respond, most of them agreed that there's a problem. Some people have done fencing, some people have tried a bit of baiting and fumigation, and a good number of people were interested in working with their neighbours to engage contractors to do something about the rabbits. So that was a survey. What we've also been doing, which worked particularly well, was property inspections. So the biosecurity staff came out in July and inspected over 170 properties throughout Gibston. So they went on to every single property, and they gave those properties a score on the modified McLean scale to indicate the level of rabbit infestation on those individual properties. And what we've identified is that at least 50% of the properties in Gibston have a rabbit infestation to a level that would be considered non-compliant under the rules of the pest management plan. So we use this information to generate a heat map, because when you ask people where the rabbits are, people will tell you that the rabbits are just everywhere. And what we found is the rabbits are everywhere, but there are definitely areas in Gibston where the problem is more prevalent. It's more of a problem than in other areas. And there's a number of different factors to that. So what you can see from this heat map is that we do have some areas where we really would need to focus our efforts in terms of managing rabbits if we're going to make a difference in Gibston. So what's the difference between properties that have a problem and those that don't have such a big problem? Well, the ones that really have quite a high level of infestation, common characteristics: undeveloped, unkept, lots of habitats, so lots of scrub rabbits to hide under or rocks, or they might have good cover adjacent to lawns. You know, rabbits like to hide in the scrub and then come out and graze on the nice, well-kept lawns. These properties might have no fencing. They might have a neighbor that's, you know, that has a high level of infestation, and that's problematic. These properties will be doing no control work, or what they're doing isn't working. And often the landowner is absent. Properties where control work is being effective, so properties that didn't have such a high level of infestation, often these are irrigated. So rabbits don't like wet grass. These properties will be more developed, there'll be more human activity, so that scares away the rabbits. They'll have fencing. Fencing is really good, keeping rabbits out. Good fencing is very good at keeping rabbits out, I should say. These landowners are doing control work, and it's effective, and often the landowner will actually live on the property as well. So just to reiterate that, you know, you might not have a lot of rabbits burrowing, you know, living on your property, but you might have a nice green kept lawn that the rabbits like to graze on. So even if the rabbits are not living on your property, if they are coming onto your property or moving through your property, or if they're just seeking refuge on your property, then, you know, you are still contributing to the problem, the rabbit problem in the wider Gibson area. And, you know, that's why we wanted to produce this heat map as well, is to show that the rabbit problem is not a property problem, it is an area problem. And we do want people to start thinking beyond their own backyards and thinking about, you know, how they may or may not contribute to the problem in the wider area. And so when we talk about, you know, problem areas, we acknowledge that there is a large strip of land along the river, which is owned by the Department of Conservation, and that this strip of land does house a lot of rabbits. And so we've spoken to the Department of Conservation on several occasions, and we've had them out on site. And so we have some statements here from the Department of Conservation, and we do have representatives from DOC in this meeting as well. And so sorry, this is a bit of a wordy slide, but they gave me these quotes and I didn't want to change it because these are their quotes. But basically DOC have said that they acknowledge the rabbit problem, that the conservation land in Gibston, they acknowledge that these parcels have got high rabbit numbers. They are committed to working with ORC and those neighbouring landowners with high rabbit densities in Gibston Valley to develop workable solutions to managing these high rabbit densities. This may include fencing and or other methods like pesticide. DOC is committed to this work, but given the size and complexity of the public land in Gibston, this is not going to be a quick fix and will take some time to address. But regular communication with ORC and neighbouring landowners will be a focus at this time. So we are continuing the conversation with DOC, and we acknowledge that the DOC land is definitely part of the problem. And DOC will be handled in the same way, or the DOC land will be treated in the same way as we are working with the other landowners as well. So please don't think that through this process we're only picking on private properties. We're not. We acknowledge that all of the land in that area is part, can contribute to that problem. So everyone in that land and everyone in that area needs to contribute, needs to be part of the conversation. It's not just about picking on private landowners. So what does the Otago Regional Pest Management Plan set in terms of an objective for controlling rabbits? So the pest management plan sets different approaches for different pests: exclusion, eradication, progressive containment, sustained control. The target that has been set for rabbits is sustained control. So I just wanted to put this slide in to note that we're not looking at eradication in Gibston. That might be disappointing for some people to hear, but given the current technologies available and methods available, eradication is just not feasible. So we're looking at sustained control. So that's what we're talking about, is basically getting rabbits down to a level where they're not doing the same damage, not being such a nuisance as they are currently, and keeping them at that level. Right, another busy slide, sorry. So this is to talk about the difference between what is done typically, which is reactive rabbit control, versus strategic rabbit control. So reactive rabbit control is what we often see. And this is what happens when we are in a crisis situation. We've got an area that is absolutely, inundated with rabbits. And the immediate reaction is, right, we just need to get some of these rabbits killed. And so the focus of this strategy would be, right, let's see how many rabbits we can kill. And often what happens is that a poison job will be done. So it'll be a big pin down operation. There'll be pin down laid, and then success will be determined based on how many rabbits are killed. But what often happens, what we often see is that the pin down is dropped, rabbits are killed, and then nothing else is done until a number of years later when we've got a high level of infestation again, and we've got a big problem. And then so we have to do another pin down drop. And so that is, a bit of a cycle where we just, drop some poison, walk away, and then wait until the numbers are at crisis level again, and then react. A more strategic approach would be where we can keep an eye on rabbit numbers, and if we think they're getting high, or where we are currently with Gibson, which is they are high, then you would do a pin down job. But you're not so concerned with how many rabbits you kill. What you're concerned about is how many rabbits are left behind. Because as we all know, you can leave 10% of the population and they will breed like rabbits. So it doesn't take long before that 10% of the population, or 5% of the population even, doesn't take long for that population to bounce back. So with this more strategic approach, what we're really thinking about is long-term control. And it means that we can't just, pat ourselves on the back for killing lots of rabbits. We need to really focus, okay, we've killed lots of rabbits. What do we do with those that are left behind? And so with a more strategic approach, what you would do is possibly do a pin down job to break the back of the population. But then you really need to think about ongoing control after that to help keep on top of the ones that are left behind. And that's what you would call secondary control. And we do have examples in other places in Otago where they've been doing this. They've been doing their primary operation, their primary control. They've been doing their pin down, but they've been doing secondary control really, really well. And so they're finding now that they're keeping on top of rabbit numbers. So costs over time actually reduce, because, you're just having to do little and often. You're not having to do these big reactive control jobs every couple of years. It's about getting the numbers low and keeping them low. So that's the difference between reactive and strategic. Right, so what does this look like for Gibson? Right, so we're going to talk about what a rabbit program for Gibson might look like. But a few things that we need to make clear, which would be the kind of foundations for this program, is understanding that rabbits are part of the ecosystem. Like we talked about before, eradication is not feasible. It's really looking at long-term sustained control. And also, just because you see one or two rabbits doesn't necessarily mean that you've got a real pest problem, but it does mean that you do need to keep on top of those rabbits and keep them low. We want landowners to be developing and implementing strategic management plans rather than being reactive. So rather than just, seeing rabbits and going out and just dropping poison and walking away, we want people to be more strategic. And what would inform a strategic approach would be a management plan. And we're going to get onto that later on. And what we need to remember is there is no silver bullet. There is no one solution when it comes to rabbits. A lot of people come to us and say, why don't you just introduce a virus? If it was that easy, we would have done it. The virus has been introduced into lots of different places in Otago over, the last, however many years. And all we're seeing is immunity being developed within the rabbits. So the virus will not eradicate the population. There is no virus currently in New Zealand that will do that. And even if you did introduce a virus and it did kill off part of the population, if you leave any part of the population behind, you've still got a problem. And so it's about looking at all the different control strategies and then picking the ones that are most appropriate based on the situation. And for everyone, pretty much, you're going to have to adopt a variety of different methods in your management plan. So what would this look like for Gibson? What are we hoping to achieve? Well, what would be great would be if, in this first year, that we get everyone to understand the rules and responsibilities, and that we get everyone to understand, appreciate, and adopt a target of sustained control for those rabbits. We're going to encourage groups to form where possible. So, we talked previously about looking beyond your own backyard. There are lots of benefits in working with your neighbours to get on top of this problem. And I'm going to give you some examples later on of where people have done this successfully in other places in Otago. We would like people to look at developing management plans. And again, I'll get onto that later on. And what we would like to see more of is fencing, probably some poison operations next winter, and to people to start thinking about that secondary control work. So, if you are going to do pin down, if you're going to do a poison job, what do you need to do after that to get on top of the rabbits that are left behind? So if we do that successfully, then maybe next year, what would that look like? Well, it means that the rabbit population would be significantly reduced. The community, the Gibson community, is well educated and skilled in this, and that the groups are working together to increase their impact. Strengthen numbers, working together collectively with your neighbours. People keep on with their management plans and keep on with their control work. And then beyond that, what would that look like? Well, we would get to, if this works well, we'll get to a stage where the population is under control. And there are places in Otago where they've achieved this. Again, groups working together, people implementing their management plans, further control work going on. And ideally, the amount of control work required would decrease over time, but no, it'll never stop. Trying to keep on top of rabbits is going to be an ongoing challenge, but with a coordinated strategic approach, we'll actually get a lot further than we have to date. So where's ORC in this? So as I touched on earlier, ORC does not collect rates to do rabbit control. We're here to do education, awareness, advocacy, facilitation, and compliance. So we've talked before about management plans, about trying to help landowners to do management plans. And what we propose to do for Gibston is to require high risk properties to submit a management plan. So going back to that heat map, it would be properties that scored above 4 or above on the modified McLean scale. So we've filtered that out and we've got a list of all of those properties, and we're going to ask those properties to submit a management plan. Education and awareness for everybody, including the high risk properties and everybody else. Some technical advice, compliance inspections. So we've already started that process. We did that in July. We went out there and did some inspections and we identified where those high risk properties are. And for those high risk properties, we're going to follow up with some compliance work. So basically we're going to ask for a management plan, try and get people to do the work voluntarily. If they don't, we have to follow that up with some compliance work, because it's not fair on people who are doing this voluntarily if their neighbours are not, essentially. Because you might be doing lots of control work, you put up a fence, you spend money, and if you're constantly under attack from your neighbour, then that's just not a coordinated approach, and it's not fair on the people who are doing work. So for those high risk properties, so they are going to be our focus, our ORC, they're going to be our focus. So those are, as I touched on, those are the properties that scored higher than 3 on the modified McLean scale, where we identified, right, these guys need to get onto this pretty quickly. So for those high risk properties, we will be asking them to submit a management plan. That would be, we'll be requiring them to submit a management plan by December. If they submit a management plan and the control strategy outlined in that management plan looks to be appropriate, and we are satisfied that they are going to do the right thing within an appropriate time frame, then we'll keep in touch with those landowners and we'll offer them support and guidance if they need it, but we'll be satisfied that they're going to do the right thing and we don't need to hassle them too much. If those high risk properties do not submit a management plan, or what they submit, we're not convinced that they are going to do the right thing within an appropriate time frame. So for example, if we have someone who has a high level of infestation and they have a large property and they suggest that they're going to get a ferret in or do some shooting, we would have doubts that that's going to be effective. If you've got a high level of infestation, you really do need to start with a poison operation. So if we are not convinced that these people are going to do the right thing within an appropriate time frame, then we are going to follow up with them a bit more intensely. And so we're going to come back in March and do inspections on those properties. And if they are deemed to be non-compliant, at that point, we'll issue what is called a notice of direction. So this is a formal compliance notice. So this is when we begin the formal compliance process for those properties. So we're giving everyone an opportunity to convince us that they're going to do the right thing voluntarily. If we're not convinced, then we'll send you down this pathway, which is a formal compliance process. And then that notice of direction will require those people to make sure that they are compliant by the end of winter. So then we come back at the end of winter, and if those properties are still non-compliant, then we will issue a notice of intention to undertake default work. So basically that is where ORC will get a contractor to come in and do the work for you and then send you the bill. So you might say, you know, well, why wouldn't people just wait for that? Because it means that you have no, you have little choice in how that work is done. You will be sent the bill, and actually any costs incurred by ORC from the notice of direction can be charged to the landowner as well. So that is the kind of, what that slide there shows is essentially like a drafting gate for these high-risk properties. They'll end up down one side or the other, depending on their response when we ask them to submit a management plan. Right, so for people who want to get on and do something, here's some examples of what you might like to do based on what's worked elsewhere in Otago. So here we have a property, which is in Gibson. The beds, they are on Camp Road, and we're showcasing this property because these guys have done a really fantastic job. They've got 4.9 hectares and they've worked on their own in this situation. And the first thing they did is they put up a fence, a really good rabbit fence, including a gate. So often we hear about people putting up fences, but they don't put in a gate. So if you really want your fence to be effective, you need to have a gate and you need to shut it. We also hear about people leaving their gate open during the day because they think that rabbits don't move around during the day, but I'm sure all of you in Gibson have seen rabbits during the day. So yes, it is important to keep your gate closed. What they've also been doing, because they put up their fence and they closed the gate, but you know, there's still rabbits inside the property. So they were shooting, they were filling up holes, filling the rabbit holes. So that's called habitat modification, where you go through and you actually, you know, fill in the burrows. Fumigation using magtoxin, which is a product that you can buy, you know, anyone can go and buy it. And they maintain their fencing. That's really important. So you have to put up a fence. It has to be a good fence built to the right specifications, and then it needs to be maintained. What challenges have they had? Well, the neighboring properties around them, including Dockland, sorry to Dock to pick on you again, but there is Dockland next to them. Some of the land around them is quite heavily infested, and that means that they're constantly under attack. So their fence is constantly under attack, and they do have to keep the gate closed all the time. Here's an example of where 12 landowners got together, and rather than building a fence around every single individual property, which they decided was going to be costly, these people decided they didn't like the look of it, and also I think their covenant wasn't allow them to do that either. So what they decided to do instead is to get together and chip in, and they built a fence around the whole lot. So rather than a fence around every individual property, they built one big fence around all 12. And, you know, they decided right at the beginning, what is our goal? And our goal is they want to keep the rabbits out of their gardens. They want to be able to grow things in their gardens, and they don't want the rabbits to eat them. So they actually agreed on a common goal right at the beginning. So, you know, that was what was the formation of their management plan. Everybody in that 12 lot subdivision was on board. And, you know, they said that as soon as they put that fence in, they saw a significant drop in rabbit numbers. So the fencing made a huge difference for these guys, but they still have rabbits in there because, you know, they've only just put the fence up. And so they've got a contractor coming out regularly to do ferreting, dogging, night shooting, and maintaining that fence to make sure that they get on top of the rabbits that are inside. Hopefully they do get on top of them so that they can, pretty much get rid of them within that small area. Admittedly, these guys don't have a gate, so they will be constantly having to do work in there. Here's a really interesting example. So Pest-Free Peas and Moorings. So Pest-Free Peas and Moorings is a charitable trust, and they got themselves set up to do lots of pest control in that whole Peas and Moorings area. So it's 130 hectares and 400 households we're talking about. But Pest-Free Peas and Moorings is a group of only 10 volunteers, and they go out twice a week for 1 hour. And what they do is habitat modification, which I touched on before, which is basically filling in burrows, and they do magtoxin. So basically they're just fumigating burrows and filling them in. But because they're just chipping away at it, little and often, they're really, really getting on top of the rabbit problem in Peas and Moorings. So this is 10 people getting on top of a problem that covers an area of 400 households. So they do have that natural barrier on the eastern side there with Lake Dunstan. On the left-hand side, on the western side, there is some fencing, but because those neighbouring landowners can see all the great work that the charitable trust is doing within the housing area, some of those landowners are getting on board now, and they're helping to complete the fencing along those barriers. And also one of the neighbours to the north, which was Fulton Hogan, they've helped with cattle stops along the cycle trail. I'm not convinced that the cattle stops are going to stop the rabbits. It might slow them down, but we do hear that rabbits can jump quite far. So they're going to keep an eye on that. And if that doesn't work, they're going to look at some other kind of barrier to put on the cycle trail that goes along the lake edge there. Bendermere subdivision, this is in Lake Hayes. A little bit different. Most people wouldn't be in this situation where your property is managed by a body corporate. But it is a big area, 110 hectares, 42 landowners, and they do have groundsmen who help to look after rabbits. Again, most of us wouldn't be able to have a groundsman. But something that's really interesting about this example is that the landowners help the groundsman to do his job through what they call a white pole system. So people who live there, when they're out and about walking around, if they see an active warren, or if they see a breach of the fence or a hole in the fence or a problem with the fence, they'll stick a white pole in it. And so when the groundsman's coming out doing his work, he knows where he needs to focus his attention and focus his work. So that's just an example of, a community working together. Okay, having a groundsman's out of most of our leagues, but it just shows a community working together to get on top of a problem that affects everybody. So if you decide that, okay, that sounds cool, I want to work with my neighbors and I want to do something about this, or, I can't work with the neighbors, I'm going to do something on my own, what can I do? So there are different control options. Fencing is always going to be a good option when you can put it in. So it has to be a good fence, installed well and maintained. I've been out around Lake Hayes all last week doing rabbit work, and I've seen lots of fences that have been constructed poorly or that haven't been maintained. And so, your fence is only as good as the quality of the fence, really. And I've got some tips on fencing. Fencing is great because if you're going to do any control work, fencing is going to help to extend the effectiveness of your investment, essentially. We hear about people paying thousands of dollars to a contractor who comes in and does a pin down operation or does some other control, and within a couple of months the rabbits are back, and that's because they haven't got a fence. I would question why the contractor isn't talking to them about that. But I don't know exactly what went on, but fencing is always a good option. If you have a high level of rabbits, high level of infestation, then you really need to break the back of that population using Pindone, which is the pesticide. There's two different ways of doing Pindone. Carrot baiting is probably the most effective, and it is good for a wide area, a large area. But the carrot bait, it's a liquid pindone which is applied to carrots and then they're put out. That needs to be done by a licensed operator. You can buy pindone in pellet form, and you can do that without a license, and you can use it in a feeder without a license. But we hear lots of examples of people using the pellets incorrectly. And so, you know, please, if you are going to use the pindone pellets, please read all of the information and the product information sheets carefully. Otherwise, it's not going to be effective and you're wasting your money. And so, you know, pindone might be good, pindone pellets, sorry, might be good if you're dealing with a smaller area, but if you're dealing with a larger area with a high level of infestation, you know, really you're looking at a carrot job with a contractor. Once you've got on top of your population, or if you're not dealing with a high level of infestation, or you're just dealing with a smaller area, you might look at some of the other options, you know, fumigation, which we touched on before, the mycotoxin down the burrows, shooting if that's appropriate. I understand that you can use a slug gun without a license, and that can be effective. But, you know, if you're going to use a rifle or anything else, and obviously there's lots of legal requirements around that. Habitat modification, which touched on before, which is, you know, filling in burrows, or perhaps if you've got a lot of scrub, which rabbits are living under, if you were to remove that, then that'll help to remove some of their habitat. And then there's other options for kind of really getting on the last, if you're getting on top of like the last few rabbits, then, you know, dogging, ferreting, long netting, trapping. But of course, you know, there are lots of rules and regulations around a lot of these control methods. So you need to make sure that you understand those before you embark on anything. And for a lot of these, it would be most effective if you just engage a contractor to do it. So if you are going to engage a contractor, you know, what things might you want to consider? Well, what is their experience? Have they done lots of operations locally? If your contractor is going to give you a quote, we would expect that they would actually come and inspect your property or make sure they understand your property before they give you a quote. If they're not interested in doing that, then I would question, you know, how good their quote is. Also, you know, we would like to see contractors talking to you about your long-term plan here, rather than just coming out and dropping poison and walking away. We want them to really be thinking, you know, talking with you and working with you on what your long-term plan is here. And, you know, if you want to know, you know, who's a good contractor to use, talk to your neighbors, you know, go and talk to people who've got well-maintained properties and ask what they do. It might be that when you go and talk to your neighbors, you find out that they actually want some work done as well. So you can look at saving some costs by engaging a contractor together. Fencing. If you are going to do fencing, here's some tips on fencing. Anything more with the fence mesh that you use, if your holes in the mesh are more than 4 centimeters, 40 mils big, it can be effective against larger rabbits, but the babies will get through. And so, you know, that can still be a problem. Wire netting is what we recommend. Don't use plastic. Rabbits can chew through plastic, and they can actually break through the very thin wire as well. So what you want to look for is the strongest gauge wire that you can find, but with the smaller holes. And so, you know, where can you get this from? Talk to your neighbors who've got good rabbit fences, talk to, you know, find out who they used. You know, go online, have a look. There's different products being made available all the time. So just keep an eye out. You want your fence to be at least 600 high, if not 900 would be great. Anything lower than that, rabbits can just jump over. And of course, there needs to be a skirt at the bottom. Ideally, that would be buried into the ground, but a lot of you guys are on dry, rocky ground. So what you do instead is you create a bit of a skirt at the bottom and you pin it and you cover it in rocks to stop the rabbits just going straight underneath. At your gateway, don't forget about your gateway. You know, if you put in a gate, rabbits can get under the gate. So put something there to stop them from getting under the gate. And just remember, people talk about a rabbit-proof fence. There's no such thing. You know, it can help definitely stop the rabbits, but if it's not well maintained, then it's not going to be as effective. And so there's a link there to a website that has some more information about rabbit fencing as well. But again, you know, go and talk to your neighbors, go and see who's got a good fence and ask who they use to put up the fence, ask what they use, ask how they're getting on, see if they're having any problems with it. Little note here about the Fencing Act. So there is a legislation that can be called upon to ask your neighbours to contribute to the cost of fencing if they're not willing to initially. I've never personally tried to do this, so I can't say how well this works, but the legislation says that occupiers of adjoining lands not divided by an adequate fence are liable to contribute in equal portions. And an adequate fence is defined as a fence that is reasonably satisfactory for the purpose that it serves or is intended to serve. So, if you want to put in rabbit-proof fence for the purposes of controlling rabbits or, helping to manage rabbits, could that be considered an adequate fence? And then could you ask for your neighbour to contribute to it? So just a reminder that that piece of legislation doesn't apply to roads, national parks, railway land, dock marginal strip land, or esplanade reserve. So those of you who border the dock land, which is marginal strip down there, just bear in mind that we don't think this Fencing Act necessarily applies to them. So if DOC do come to you suggesting a cost share on the fencing, I would jump on that, because I think that is something that they're doing because they want to, not because they have to. So what's the next steps? So we will be sending a letter to high-risk properties requesting that they submit a management plan by December. And for everybody else, we recommend that you prepare a management plan for your property if you don't already have one. And so we will be sending you the template, but we will be noting that it's not compulsory unless you are a high-risk property. We'll also send you a link to our website, which has got some further information about different control options. And for those of you who wish to prepare a management plan, whether you're going to do that voluntarily or whether you're being required to do it because you're a high-risk property, we're going to be organising a drop-in session on Thursday, the 18th of November. That'll be at the Lake Hayes Pavilion from 6 o'clock till 8 o'clock. So depending on COVID restrictions, we might have to stagger the numbers slightly, but please come along if you want some help with preparing your management plan, or you want some further information about how to manage rabbits, even on your property. You can bring us a map of your property and we can have a chat to you. Our biosecurity staff will be there, and they came through, all of your properties back in July. So they've got a good understanding about a lot of people's properties. And so we're there to provide you information and to give you some help to come up with a management plan. So, when you're looking at this menu of control options, you can really put that into the context of a long-term strategic plan for your property with the help of biosecurity staff who will be available on that evening. Right, so now we're going to have a question session, and I can see there's quite a number of questions in the chat box. So there's myself, there is Richard and Nathan as well, who are from the biosecurity team, and they're going to help to answer some questions. So Andrea is going to read the questions, and then either myself or Nathan will or Richard will respond.
Excellent, thanks, Hilary. So just to let everybody know who's here from, first of all, Ken, apologies, it is Gibbston, not Gibbston Valley, so answering that question first. Thank you for that. We've got myself, so I'm the Manager of Environmental Implementation at Otago Regional Council, and we have Gavin Palmer here, who's the General Manager of Operations from Otago Regional Council. I think we've also got Councillor Alexa Forbes, and we have a staff member from DOC, David Butt, and Annie Gunn from Land Information New Zealand, and we also have a lot of other ORC technical staff here. So I'll throw to a few of those, but I'll try and answer as many questions as I can first. And there's one last one here. Okay, so Ken, you've asked several questions, which is great. Thank you for that engagement. We're just going to stick to rabbits, so we'll follow up with you later about your gorse and broom question. Your first question was just around making contact with people before we're entering their property. So that's definitely our preferred means of operating, but we can't necessarily always make contact with people. So under the Biosecurity Act, Section 119, we have the powers to enter a property, but we definitely prefer to make that engagement. So we have contacted people by letters and following up as much as possible. So yeah, that's and staff do a health and safety and a hazard assessment when they enter a property. I will ask the biosecurity team in a minute to just comment on your question about using pallets that are not working, and potentially Doc might be able to assist with the question you've noted or made the assumption or assertion that rabbits have increased with the eradication of ferrets. And you've also noted that the high country areas also need to be inspected. So yes, we very much view that as part of our business as usual work. It's important that all of the different types of properties are doing their part. In general, those high country stations understand what the issues are and what the solutions are. So, but they are also inspected as well as part of our regular work. Sherry asked a question around will Doc help with fencing? So in a minute I'm going to unmute David from Doc. And Hilary pointed out that under the Fencing Act, Doc, there's no requirement, but David will just give us an update on Doc's plans for the area. And Sherry also asked if we were following up with Doc and Lynn, so they're both here tonight, which is fantastic. And yes, we'll be following up with all different landowners in Gibston. Now, Q wanted to know what Doc's plans are. So once I've worked out how to multitask here, I will throw that back over to David, that question, and I'll just keep track of that. Ken also raised around the height of fencing. So I think Hilary addressed that, the higher the better. And we're just also providing some additional information on our website to make that really clear. And Rob asked the plan to keep absentee landowners engaged. So we are trying to reach people as much as possible. We can engage them in a polite way and I guess a more firm way through our compliance activities. And also it's really helpful in some of the other communities we've been working in where people can put us in touch. Often neighbours have email addresses and things like that that we don't always have ready access to. So we do plan on keeping in touch as much as we possibly can with those absentee landowners. So, David, I think I'm just hopefully allowed you to talk to the group. Just to summarise, there's been a question around any Doc assistance to help with fencing and how we're following up with you. I don't know if you can talk about if it's Doc that's been eradicating ferrets in the area or not, and just in general what Doc's plans are for this area.
Yeah, can you hear me? Got me well?
Yep.
Perfect. Alrighty. So Doc have done a site visit and welcome everyone. So as I said, as Andrea touched on, my name's David Butt, so Ops Manager at Doc. Relatively new there, sort of have started in the last 4 or 5 months. So yeah, in that time, we've had a site visit with ORC. As you can imagine, we've got a fair bit of land in the area, and part of it at the moment is prioritising it. You know, we're not going to solve everything off the bat, so fully appreciate you know, some of the concerns that have been raised today. The key at the moment for us is working through the management plan, working through those areas that are really high concentration in some of the major problem areas. In terms of fencing, so we at Doc we basically go through a capital bid process. And usually we'll reach out to the adjacent landowner and look to cost share as well. So certainly for those, once we've developed up sort of our management plan, we'll certainly have no problem sharing that with the group in terms of what we plan on doing. But it will be a combination of fencing and you know, various poisoning, etc. So yeah, hopefully that sort of covers it. As I said, more than happy, and I'll certainly be at the Lake Hayes session, and more than happy to speak to people individually, but certainly Doc are engaged and will be engaged moving forward.
Thank you, David. Okay, there's a couple of more technical questions. So Richard, if you can just unmute yourself in the first instance. So it should be a wee pop-up that says unmute. So thanks, Richard. This is Richard Lord, who's our delivery lead for biosecurity for Central Otago. So Richard, the first question is just if you can make some comments about the toxicity of pindone and just the sort of process around managing domestic cats and dogs. I think we've got a vet here in the audience, just interested in the steps that we would take facilitating a more large-scale poison or control activity in the area, and how we would manage that with the landowners and with domestic cats and dogs.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Good evening, everyone. It's the cats were probably a wee bit tricky in terms of being able to manage cats, and that really does mean you've got to keep them inside as much as you can, or certainly know their movements. If you allow them to roam, yes, there is a possibility cats will get into dead rabbit carcasses. And pindone being an anticoagulant, they may not die, but repeated exposure to the pindone bait or pindone rabbits, it could affect them ultimately if they had enough. But they could die. With dogs, we will certainly encourage people to keep them on a lead, and they're a lot more easier to manage. But certainly just don't allow them to roam at all. We would, encourage people not to have their dogs. If you're going to take them for a walk, take them into areas where the poison hasn't been laid would be a better option again. Is there any further information required there, Andrea?
I think there's one other question, but I understand we have somebody who's an expert in pindone. I've just got to find them on the screen. Peter, are you here? East, there we go. Peter, are you okay if I ask you a question? I'm just gonna, that's Peter Visser here from, can I put you on the spot, Peter? Well, I have, so you can hang up or run away. Are you okay to answer a question just around the, Ken has suggested that the pellets he's using isn't working. Is there anything that you can suggest from your perspective about how to have more effective outcomes using pellets? You are, I have to, sorry, I'm just going to unmute you. It should pop up. Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Yes, quite a lot to talk about there. It's probably the most common question asked when people discuss about pindone. And sorry, I just got in here a bit late. I've just arrived in Cromwell and I didn't know I was talking to this afternoon, but that's all good. So nice to be part of the presentation and hear what's going on. In terms of why it doesn't work, there are a number of reasons. Probably the most common is that most people will look at their population and underestimate how many rabbits they have present, and as a result, they underfeed. And so what they forget is that the buck is a very dominant male and will stop a lot of the others from feeding. And so while you get a little bit of uptake until that buck actually dies, there's not too many, or too many rabbits are actually not feeding on that bait station. So the important thing is to have a number of bait stations and to have the presence of bait there for a long enough period of time. And that's probably the number one reason that the bait actually isn't feeding. Remember, it's a first generation bait. It's a multi-feed bait. So a rabbit would need to take, as a full grown rabbit, roughly around about 20 pellets over 3 nights or days. That's about 7 pellets a day, not necessarily consecutive, but it needs to have a reasonable volume. The other most common is that the bait is actually being taken by something else. Rats are notorious for it. They will keep on taking bait as long as they're present and cache that bait and store it and not actually even eat it. And you think you're doing a good job, but in actual fact, it's been stolen. So that's another common occurrence. And also possums. Possums, remember, take twice the amount to kill, or more than that rabbits do, but this is a half strength bait. Rabbits are very susceptible, but possums aren't. So generally, we would try and take care of the possums with another bait if they're in your area, to reduce the chance of them actually taking the bait. So that's just a few answers. There's a lot of other reasons, but that's probably the most primary or the most logical ones.
Thank you, Peter. So we've got one question from Don, who is asking about ORC's plans for reintroduction of the RHD virus. So I'm just going to throw to Richard Lord here.
Thanks, Andrea. Just a bit about the virus. Look, there is no further viruses that could be introduced in New Zealand. They just don't exist. If we go back to 1997, August 97, when the illegal introduction of the virus was introduced, that virus is actually still quite active in many areas of Otago. And it does cycle through rabbit populations, anything from 3 to 5 times per annum. The most effective hit when that goes through is that really the late summer, early autumn hit. But any time from October through to that period, it can go through. There's another virus out there that came in at the same time or just before the K5 was released, and it was called the V2. No one really knows how it got in, but it was in existence before the K5 was released, and it became a very dominant virus and pretty much knocked the K5 to touch in effect. But the V2, there's no consistency with that. It just sort of pops up. When it did come through here, just after the K5 was released, it was certainly by far the most dominant virus and had quite a knockback with rabbit populations. But as I say, there's no real cycle, no predictability with that one. Unlike the V1, we know it does go through. So look, at this stage, as I said, that there are no viruses. People talk about making more releases of the virus. Well, the virus is already out there. It is active. And as Hilary alluded to before, in some parts of Otago, we've got rather high resistance to the virus.
Thank you, Richard. All right. I believe that I've answered all of the relevant, all the questions related to rabbits at least. I appreciate this format's not ideal, but as Hilary said, we'll be having a drop-in session following this in November, so that allows you to have a bit more one-on-one engagement. And you've all got our contact details. So shall I throw back to you, Hilary? I'll just double check. I know there's one more message down here. Okay. Over to you, Hilary, and I'll just scroll back up and I'll jump in if I think I've missed anything.
Yep, cool. So yeah, thank you very much to everybody for coming along tonight. We really appreciate it. We understand that this is not everyone's favorite format, but I think it's been a good conversation. Thank you to Peter for letting us put you on the spot, and David as well. You guys weren't expecting to speak tonight. So thank you very much for your input, and for Richard for your help in answering the questions as well. So just to reiterate, and if I can just share my screen again and skip right to the end. There is going to be a drop-in session on Thursday the 18th of November, 6 to 8, the Lake Hayes Pavilion. We will be requesting high-risk properties to submit a management plan. We encourage everybody else to do a management plan as well, and we'll be sending you all a template. And if you want help with those management plans, please come along to the drop-in session. Yeah, so we look forward to seeing you all there. That would be fantastic. Please come along. We will send information out in the mail about that, and email addresses as well. And yeah, so look forward to seeing you all there. So I think I'm good to sign off. Yes, Andrea, thumbs up.
Yep, thank you, everyone. Oh, thank you. Also, I didn't realise that Queenstown Lakes District Council was also here participating. So thank you to Claire,
yes.
and also to everybody who joined today.
Right. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.